All right, good morning, everyone. I am Greg Beglau, and I will be your moderator this morning, basically just monitoring the chat. And allow me to introduce Shauna Scherer, who will be tech support. She's also mentioned in the chat that she's here to support if you have any issues. And with that, just going to ask that you stay muted during the session unless the presenter asks anybody to unmute to answer any questions. And please use chat to communicate with us if you have any questions prior to that. And again, if you have technology trouble, make sure the first thing you can try to do is exit and re-enter the session. Sometimes that often solves the problem. And then ask for help from Shauna in the chat if that does not work. And with that, I will turn it over to Rebecca Eller Molitas. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. Good morning, everyone. Okay, good morning. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Rebecca Eller Molitas. I appreciate that you took the time to join this session. I am an ESL teacher at Elgin Community College, and I'm also your Illinois representative for New Readers Press. Today, we're going to be talking about book and conversation clubs for adult English language learners. We're going to begin today's session by talking about why we might offer a book club for adult English language learners. Then next, we'll look at some questions that we may need to consider when we begin planning a club. One of my favorite things about a book club is the community aspect. So we're going to talk about how to set up a group to become a community. We'll look at some educational strategies you can use in the club meetings. And finally, we'll conclude with a Q&A, and I will share some templates and organizers for you in a Google folder so that you can have some things to take home if you would like. Greg has very kindly offered to monitor the chat throughout. So if you have a question, please feel free to put it into the chat and Greg will interject as we go along. So as we get started, I would love to hear your thoughts on why you might start a book club for adult English language learners. For those of you who have another device or the ability to open another browser tab, we're going to drop a link to a Padlet in the chat. I'll send you all into breakout rooms for about 6 to 7 minutes. I know that that's not a lot of time. I want to respect the hour today, but I also want you guys to have a chance to build some community in this session. So when you get into your breakout rooms, I would like for you to please choose one or more members of your group to type your group's responses onto this Padlet. On the screen right now, you can see what the Padlet looks like. And for any of you who may be new to Padlet, it is a fun, free way that you can collaborate virtually for any of you all who are teaching remotely. So here is what you do. You'll open the link that Greg has shared in the chat, and you'll see this page here. In the bottom corner of the Padlet, you can see a pink circle with a plus sign. When you click that circle, a white box will come up on the Padlet and you can type whatever response you would like. Then just click anywhere off of the white box to record your answers. So we're going to go into breakout rooms. You will choose a person to write on the Padlet for your group, and then we'll come back together and share our responses. Does anybody have questions on what to do before we move into our breakout rooms? Okay, I'm going to assign you now. Please have a wonderful time in your breakout rooms.
How's the turnout, Rebecca?
Welcome back, as I always tell my students when they're so surprised when they end up with me back in the main session again. Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to share your responses with you. We got some great answers. Why use book clubs with adult English language learners? Many of you suggested that they're good for building community or bonds. The story connects people emotionally and sparks empathy. It can help build connection. It provides a view into the culture of the target language. It can lead to broader discussions about culture. There are many responses here about looking at cultures, and you can provide different experiences for different levels of students. One group mentioned that it can help over the summer to maintain skills and connection, increase vocabulary, conversational skills. Again, cultural knowledge was a big theme here, and provide a natural context for teaching vocabulary and grammar. It can also be great for academic skills, like allowing a deeper dive into character and plot, enhancing vocabulary, allowing students to interpret materials, and teacher-supported reading instruction. Another group mentioned that there are a lot of benefits to oral speech development, including vocabulary. It can lower the language barrier. Students learn from one another, which helps them to build community, and it can build confidence in students. Group 3, great job, mentioned some benefits and challenges. Advanced students like an overarching story, and they can become invested in wanting to know what happens next so that they'll keep attending and build retention. Finally, if a challenge can be that if a student misses a week, they may fall behind in some key elements of the story, and that can make it more difficult for them to keep up and continue with the class. Let's look at a little bit more information on this. So why start a book club? You guys covered many of these, but I have a few things that I wanted to share with you. In a book club, there's emphasis on reading, comprehending, and being understood in a discussion. The conversation is student-driven rather than text-driven. Students are able to discuss issues that they care about. As many of you said, it builds community, including helping students feel like part of an English-speaking adult group. Tell us in the chat, have any of you who are in this presentation today ever learned a new language? Yes, Daniel has learned 2 languages. Way to go, Daniel. English and Chinese. Maria, fantastic. Lane, Korean. That is amazing. Have any of you ever lived in a place where you didn't speak the dominant language? Tell us in the chat. China and Thailand. Some no's, Korea and Japan. Taylor, I was in Japan as well. Spain, China, Italy, Korea, Kosovo. You guys are fantastically well traveled. I think this is why we all love ESL teaching so much. So you know that when you are living in a country where you don't speak the dominant language, there are some changes to personality, and it can be hard to feel like the same person that you felt in your home environment. And finally, a book and conversation club is a good way to promote family literacy if your program has a focus on that. Parents read, and that provides a role model for their children. Also, we all know that research shows a strong correlation between the literacy rate of the parents, especially the mother, and a child's educational outcomes. So increased exposure to English reading can also encourage students to pursue their own interests by reading magazines, newspapers, etc. at home, and this provides role models for others in the household. So let's talk a bit about planning. The first time I started a book club for English language learners, I recruited a group of students and gave them a choice of a few books that I had on hand. My lack of planning created more ambiguity than I would have liked for the students and for me. I've created several book clubs now, and over time, I've found that it's helpful to set aside some time for planning and to ask some questions of myself and my team. So I've divided those questions into 4 categories today: why, who, what, and how. This is definitely not an exhaustive list, and I'd love to hear your ideas about other things that should be included in this planning phase when we get to the Q&A at the end. Let's start with why. What is the purpose of this book club? Educators start book clubs for a lot of different reasons, and our goals have a tremendous impact on the planning process. Is your primary goal to build academic skills? If so, will you be acting as a teacher or as a facilitator in the book club? Are you teaching content with the books that you select, or are you teaching reading and language skills? Another thing to consider is, are you starting a book club to combat the summer slide or even the new COVID slide? Several of you mentioned this in the reasons to start a book club earlier. Is building community and relationships and belonging the ultimate motivation for your book club? If so, you might handle things a little bit differently than if your primary goal is academic skill. And finally, is this a casual group for people who already love reading, or is cultivating an interest in reading one of the main reasons that you're starting a book club? Because that will have a major impact on what you choose to read. Okay, so once we've decided why we're doing this, we need to think about who the audience will be for our book club. Is this group open to students at all levels, or is it targeted to particular leveled groups? Do students need to be co-enrolled in an academic program in conjunction, or are they free to join the book club as a standalone option? If this is a family literacy program where you're working, a very important thing to consider is, will children be present? If so, do you need to provide childcare for siblings who are outside the target age range of your book club group? If you do need to do that, one thing that I have found it's very important to look into in advance is whether or not there are insurance considerations that you need to explore before you set up any kind of childcare options at your site. Okay, so we know why we're doing it. We know who our students are going to be. The next thing that I like to think about is the what. Let's start with, what will you read and how will those resources be chosen? High interest reading is very important. Reading in a non-native language is challenging. So whether you're reading fiction or nonfiction, we need to make sure the content is appealing to our learners so that they are motivated to continue in the club. Some of you mentioned retention. That's so important based on what we choose to read. We'll need to think about if you want to choose articles, short stories, or essays to be included in your club, or are you just reading books? Will you choose the books, or will the book club members have a choice in what they're reading? One of my favorite ways to do this is to work with a librarian or a department resource coordinator and make a short list of suitable materials that we have available. Then I write descriptions of those books, just very short descriptions based on student level, and let every member of the book club rank the choices. I like to keep this to 4 choices or less, but it could vary depending on how many students you have and what their levels are. After the students rank their resources, we use those rankings to decide what to read first. I really like to start out with something that a majority of the class is interested in engaging with. Another thing to think about when you're choosing your what is the type of resource that you need. Do you need print books? Do you need large print? Do you need ebooks, audiobooks, or do you need a combination of options? It's very important to consider accessibility in this phase of your planning. In the planning stages, we don't always know who will choose to attend the book club. In every book club that I've ever done, I have had multiple students in the group who requested large print text. We know that in adult ed, we often find that there are students who maybe need vision help or glasses and aren't able to get that support. So having large print available can be very helpful. In one of the clubs that I facilitated, we had a participant who was legally blind, and she accessed her books through the National Library Service for the Blind through the Library of Congress. So in that situation, it was really important that we choose titles they had available. Similarly, if you're planning on using listening and audio as a teaching tool in your book club, you may want to make sure that you have transcripts available for any participants who have hearing differences. So in this phase of your planning, it can be important to make sure you're choosing things that can be accessed in multiple ways. As I said, keep in mind, you may need print, you may need digital, you may need audio, and be sure that font size is taken into consideration. Okay, now let's look at the how of the book club. One big question is always, how are you going to measure success of the club? Are you accountable to a funder for this project? If so, we need to think about what their expectations for success might be and how you need to present your reporting information to them. How frequently do they need you to report back? This could have an impact on how you decide to schedule your club. Also, some funders prefer data such as attendance, hours, test scores, but others prefer student impact narratives. So you'll need a relationship with your students and to know who in your group might be willing to share a little bit of the story of how they're impacted by the book club. Are you looking for increases in TABE or CASAS scores? If so, this can really impact the types of reading materials you choose, as well as the learning activities that you decide to incorporate. Another popular measure for a book club can be learner satisfaction. If you're planning to assess learner satisfaction, you may want to develop your student surveys before you begin your book club group so that you can start your planning with the outcomes that you want to achieve already in mind. I love the saying, begin with the end in mind. And finally, attendance hours are something that in adult ed we're frequently asked to provide as a measure of success. If attendance hours is one of your goals, it can be important to think about how you're going to message attendance expectations when you start recruiting participants for a book club. So we don't want somebody thinking that they can drop in and out as they like if your goal is to have students attend every session. As we think a little bit more about that scheduling, we need to think about whether this group is going to be time-bound or ongoing. Some programs might like to run book clubs during the summer, as you guys mentioned on the Padlet earlier. Some run book clubs over the winter holidays to combat slide during that time, or to give students an emotional connection and support to their program while classes aren't being held. Other programs might choose to run a book and conversation club along with their regular term, and some choose to do book clubs year-round. Another thing that you'll want to consider is how frequently you wish to meet. Do you want to meet once per week? Are you going to meet during class time, or is this going to be a standalone activity? I have even worked with groups who like to meet twice a week and groups that met as infrequently as once a month. Okay, let's continue with planning how we might do this book club. One of the very important things to consider is obtaining resources. This can be even a little bit more tricky right now than in normal times because the schedules of what is open and what's not open changes right now, kind of based on public health. So some things to think about here are, will students need individual copies of the reading materials? And if so, how do you plan for them to obtain those books? Some of the options that have worked are program purchase. So you may have your school or program buy a classroom set of a text. Individual purchase could be an option depending on the circumstances of the students that you serve. Your program may have its own library where full sets are available, and the public library could also be an option. I have had some great success working with public libraries on book clubs. Some of the librarians have even been able to make lists of copies available by location so that students could check out a book at the location that's closest to their home. And if you're running your registration and your book club virtually, right now could even be a fantastic time, even in person, to ask a librarian to come and meet your group to help the students sign up for library cards and to show them how to check out digital resources from the library while it might not be open on a regular basis right now. Another thing we want to consider is the location of the reading. Will your students read at home, in class, or in a combination? And you guys touched on this on the Padlet earlier when you mentioned that if a student misses a session, it can be really hard to catch them up. Having students read the book at home can be a big help to students who may need more time to read and understand. Those who are slower readers, or I myself love reading, but I'm a slow reader and I read passages over and over to help me understand. You may have students who are like me, but another important sign of that coin is that not all of our students have an environment that is conducive to reading at home. So if you assign home reading, you want to make sure that participants will still be able to participate in meetings when they come to your class or your club meetings. Okay. The next thing that I would like to talk about is building community. This is one of the things that I think is so important in adult ed and that I feel really passionate about in my own classrooms. Virtual book and conversation clubs create space for English language learners to build community through the adult education classroom. This gathering can be vital to helping students feel like part of an English-speaking adult community. Some of you told us in the chat, many of you here have learned another language, or you have lived in an environment where you weren't proficient in the dominant language, and you know how isolating this can feel. When I moved to Japan, I spoke almost no Japanese at all. So for the first year, I often resorted to physical comedy and facial expressions so that I could feel like I was engaging with other people in some way. And I believe that there are a few of you in this session who know me, so you probably realize that this is extremely out of character for me. I try really hard, but I am not that funny, guys. I'm a pretty serious person. And sometimes when I tell a joke, I'm the only one who is laughing. So physical comedy was a real stretch for me. And I didn't feel like I was the same person that I feel like I am when I'm living in a language that I'm comfortable with. Even a second language that I speak was easier than being at a very basic level. I often felt like a child, and it can have a lot of impact on you when it's difficult to feel that you're an adult. So, book clubs and conversation clubs can be a great safe space for learners to communicate with other adults who are in a similar situation and to engage with them on topics that are interesting to them. In this brief little section of the presentation, we're going to explore some ways to build community. I'm particularly going to focus on Zoom because I'm teaching on Zoom right now, but these can be done in the classroom and through other platforms as well. I would love to learn a little bit about the ways that you all build community in person and virtually first. So Greg is going to drop a link to a second Padlet in the chat. We're not going to go into breakout groups this time, but I will be quiet for a couple of minutes so that you can think. If you wouldn't mind to please open that Padlet and just take a couple of minutes to share your ideas.
Okay, what is this?
Can you all see a Padlet called How Do You Build Community with Your Adult ELLs?
Huh.
Anybody need
Okay.
assistance?
No, we're just figuring it out, or I'm just figuring it out.
Oh yeah, I went over to the chat and then I found it. I didn't understand it was a new page, not from the one I had used before.
Sorry about that, guys. This is one thing I like to tell my students. We're in a brave new world and we're all just figuring it out. So it's a good chance for us to learn together. We're all adult learners. Please take about 30 more seconds, my friends, to wrap up, and we'll look at some of these together. You guys have a lot of great ideas here. Okay, if you don't mind, I'm going to share the Padlet with you just so that we can look through these together. There's a lot of great information here. So, how do you build community with your adult English language learners? Greg, can you see that Padlet?
Yes.
Okay, great. Um, one of the instructors here mentions I share struggles and then they do. So we can really let our students see that we are people. I enjoy doing that as well. Have students compare and relate parts of the story to their personal experience or culture. Build a connection with their families through activities. That's great. Partner interviews, sharing, introductions. I love that several of you have mentioned making sure students know each other's names, not just the instructor's name. I sometimes quiz my students on this because I want them to form relationships with each other. I find that it really helps retention when the students are interested in coming and seeing their classmates. Sometimes they don't want to show up for me, but they might love to see the person that they talk to every week. Having students talk about culture shock. We get some really funny talks about that in my class. Compare the home country culture with American culture. Another great way to recognize students and know their names is to see who couldn't make it today. Ask students questions about their lives, allow them to speak to each other. Yes, absolutely. A book club should never be focused on us. It's about the students. Start every day with a check-in question, quarterly conversation groups with a dinner. I love that, Donna. Having them share personal and travel stories. A lot of you are mentioning that you ask questions of your students and really get to know them more in this environment. Discuss stories with the teacher as a facilitator, find out how we think similarly or differently. That's a great idea for creating community on Zoom and in person. And it can be an opportunity to teach ways to disagree respectfully in the United States because that doesn't look the same across all cultures. Tom says he's with the Illinois State Library Literacy Office and they offer free book clubs and story kits. That is fantastic. They also lend them out. So you guys might want to get Tom's contact information before we leave this session today. I know I do. Please, Tom. And everybody mentions building community, allowing students to share personal stories. I think that you have covered all of my ideas here, but I will share just a few things from my slides that might be a little bit different than what we have seen here. One of the things that I really like to do for community building is called group norm setting. In group norm setting, all of the participants in a group co-create its rules. This can help all members of the group to feel a sense of ownership. And depending on the level of students in a particular group, I often do this by asking some very basic questions. I put the students into groups if appropriate to talk about them. Sometimes we do it individually. And I ask them things and post the answers. Then I have students vote on the most important items and those become rules for the class. Some questions that might work here include things depending on level, like what does a good teacher do? What does a bad teacher do? What does a good student do? What activities do you like? In this context, I find it very helpful to provide examples for that because students might not interpret that question in the same way that you want to ask it. You can also ask if there are some things that they really don't like to do. One of the things that consistently comes up for me every single time I do group norm setting, which I do at the start of every group, is to have a student tell me that they want to be respected. And this is usually said by multiple students in a group. So I always say, that's great. How do we show respect? What does respect look like for you? And this can generate a fantastic conversation because this is really different across cultures. Sometimes things like eye contact, touching, whether or not you talk while someone else is talking, whether or not you question a person in a group who's older than you are, those things can look really different and it can be a very rich conversation. Another thing I like is breakout rooms. These are consistently a favorite with my students. They like getting to know each other and making friends, and they like having the additional time to speak in a relaxed way. It can help improve retention because the students want to join the group and see their buddies after a difficult day. I try to keep my breakout rooms as my personal preference to a maximum of 4 people when possible. I feel like that keeps things a little bit more personal and it allows more speaking time for each participant. Polls are also a quick and fantastic way to check for understanding, and you can keep them anonymous. So this can be a really good way to get some information on whether or not content is being understood without putting any of your students in an uncomfortable situation. It's always good to take the temperature of a room and to see how your students might be feeling on a particular day. I teach night classes, so I sometimes use this to ask about the energy level in the room or how the day has been so far before we get started. I find it helpful to know when my students are particularly jazzed for a class, or sometimes people are feeling tired or sick or down about the weather, etc. If my students aren't feeling well, I know that I don't want to put the most difficult content or a reading that's very sad into the second half of the class because students just might not have the physical or emotional energy for it. And finally, polls can be a really nice tool for teaching students to read bar graphs. If you are meeting virtually, but you're not using Zoom, another tool I really like is Slido. It is free and it can be great for taking quick polls. And finally, the last community building idea I wanted to mention is community visitors. I don't think this one came up on the Padlet. If you're remote right now, we have kind of a rare and wonderful opportunity to be able to get community members to visit our groups without a lot of inconvenience to the visitors. So if you're reading a story about immigrant business owners, you might be able to get an immigrant business owner to come to your class for 15 minutes to talk a little bit about their success and how they got started. I recently read a story with my class where one of the main characters had to file a police report because someone stole from her. And we were able to get a campus police officer to come into the Zoom and talk about what it would look like if something like that happened on campus. And it also allowed the students to build a relationship of trust with those campus safety officers. In the last part of this session, we are going to talk about an EBRI-based template and explore some components that could be used in a book and conversation club if you're choosing to do your reading together rather than having the students read independently at home. We'll touch on some strategies related to warm-up work, reading skills, and wrap-ups, and you will receive a link to a Google folder where I have put an evidence-based reading instruction template and some graphic organizers which you are welcome to use and share far and wide if you like them. So let's look at this evidence-based reading instruction template. This is not the only way to do this, but it is one way that I like, and I do find that having a consistent order is very helpful. So in the warm-up phase of our reading, some things that we may want to touch on are setting an objective or doing discussion starters. You guys mentioned some great ones of these in your community building activities. We may do some phonics work and also introduce vocabulary that we know is contained in the day's reading, but might be new to the students. So it can be helpful to explore that vocabulary before we start reading. Then we can use some special reading techniques for before you read, while the students are reading, after the reading, and then now that students are more comfortable with the story and the vocabulary, it's a great time for some fluency work. You can follow that up with word work, connect some word parts like prefixes and suffixes or compound words to the reading for the day, and review the new vocabulary so students get as much opportunity as possible to internalize it. And then, of course, the discussion of what we've read. You guys mentioned many great ways that you can connect what's in the reading back to the students' lives. I'll talk about some possible strategies now, and we'll pull out a few of them for a closer look. This is by no means a complete list. The possibilities are nearly endless here. So in the warm-up phase, one of the things that you can do is to ask students to make predictions based on the title and or the cover art of a story. What type of story do you think this will be? Is it a mystery, a love story, a biography? If you're reading nonfiction, for example, a book about Abraham Lincoln, you can ask students if they've ever heard of him before. What have they heard? If you knew that there will be new vocabulary in the day's reading, begin to introduce it now and give students a chance to work with the words before the reading begins. During and after the reading, connections to personal experience are super important. This is a great time to work on academic skills if that's one of your goals, such as identifying main ideas and details, drawing conclusions, making inferences, summarizing, and asking and answering comprehension questions. Depending on the level of the group, I really like this. You may need to provide questions for your lower level readers. If you're in a mixed group, you may be able to let the higher level readers write the questions and have the lower level readers answer them. There are lots of combinations of ways that that can be done. Let's talk first about summarizing. I love this hand, which I have to admit to you that I stole from K through 12. Summarizing is a great life and work skill. In a book club, it's particularly good for challenging higher level students and for making sure everyone understands what has been read. I like to cover the who, what, when, where, and why as a whole group. And I like to save these POM questions for when students go into small groups or breakout rooms or when they're working with a partner. So we can ask questions like, who is this story or chapter or article about? What is she doing? When is this story happening? Does it take place now? Is it in the past, in the future? Where are the characters? Why is the character doing XYZ thing that they've done? Consistently following a pattern like this can help students begin to ask these questions on their own. When students move into deeper discussion, we can have them discuss how did X event in the person's life similar to a story from your own life? How are these two experiences different? Did you like this part of the story? Why or why not? A lot of times with this question, you get a yes or no answer. So we have to push beyond. Tell me why it was good. What did you like? Tell me what was bad. This is also a time that you can teach your students to ask follow-up questions to other members of the group, such as, have you ever done XYZ? What did you do next? How did you feel when that happened? Or simply just to say, tell me more. I always have a goal of moving my groups toward being as student-led as possible. And as students become more comfortable generating their own questions, they take more ownership of the group experience. I like to think of this in terms of the expression, the one who does the work does the learning. So I like my students to be as in control as possible. Another really cool thing that we can do here is sensory details. For any of my fellow book nerds who are with me here today, we all know that the book is always, always better than the movie because the movie never quite lives up to what we have imagined in our minds. Skilled readers often develop their own mental movies as they read. I like to talk about this mental movie idea with students. Creating and sharing these sensory descriptions is a good way to build both vocabulary and comprehension. Excellent way to teach adjectives. It may be easiest to begin practicing this skill using photos. For me, I like to search online for National Geographic images. The photos are stunning and they're so rich in content. You can put up a picture, and if you're trying to incorporate grammar, you can have students write sentences using particular verb tenses about what's happening. I like to ask students to imagine that they're standing in the photo. Where exactly will you stand? What do you see? What do you hear? What do you smell? What do you feel? Is it hot? Is it cold? Is it windy? Can you taste anything? Practicing with images can make this skill come more easily when students move on to visualizing from text alone. And we all know that this can be super impactful. Think about the first time that you ate one of your favorite foods. For me, it's the first time I ate Japanese ramen. I apologize for showing this to you right before lunch because I think we're all hungry right now. But think about when you first smelled that food. How did the steam feel when it hit your face? What noises did you hear around you? I remember hearing sounds from the kitchen, people slurping noodles, rumbling in my stomach. Bicycle bells were ringing out on the sidewalk because I was in this little tiny like concrete basement room. Think about what you saw when you looked down at the plate or the bowl for the first time. Did it look good and delicious? For me, I had no idea what this fish cake was. I thought that was a radish. So I was very surprised when I ate it. And I was constantly confused for my first months in Japan about the inside of these eggs. My first phrase of Japanese was without raw egg, please. That is literally the first thing that I learned. But this meal, I remember the first time I ate this. Okay, besides teaching sensory details, another thing that is great to teach in a reading and conversation club is compare and contrast. And you guys hit on this a lot in the Padlet when you mentioned comparing experiences between countries and cultures. We can let learners know that they'll compare, for example, two characters from a story to see what's different and what's the same. You can have them draw a Venn diagram. On the left-hand side of the diagram, have them write the name of one character. On the right-hand side, have them write the name of another character. And in them, they can list things that are only about the mother, things that are only about the daughter, and things that are the same. Working with a partner or small groups, they can write details from the story into the correct categories. This can also work when you want to compare a situation in a character's life at the beginning of the story and the end. For example, I love Harry Potter. If you can say what happened in here, what was Harry Potter's life like before Hogwarts, after Hogwarts, and what was the same. Using this example that's up on the slide, the mother-daughter, this can also have be a good conversation starter in your group if you have participants who are raising children in a culture that's not the culture that they grew up in. It can be a nice time for them to get some support around that. So the last thing I want to do quickly is to show you some resources that I like. I used these two books heavily as I worked through trying to make book clubs virtual this year. Teaching Effectively with Zoom was just published last year. It's available on Amazon. It is fantastic if you want to know more about teaching with Zoom. This book, Creating Book Clubs in the English Language Classroom, a model for teachers of adults, is from 2006. I got my copy on Amazon. Some of the things here involve writing your own stories or using children's books. And depending on what kind of book club you're working in, this may or may not work for you, but do know this is an excellent resource, but it is published before we had so many emerging adult readers available to us. Here are some books that I particularly like. The Cell Phone Lot is the one I mentioned that has a story about a person who needs to file a police report. If you have very low-level readers, these are at about NRS level 2, and they are hilarious adventure stories about a family named the Silvas. This family gets into crazy situations, and there's always a lot of laughter in this. And of course, here's a series of mysteries from Rapid Reads. If you have students who prefer mystery novels, every group is a little bit different. As you guys can see, I really indulged my tendency to love graphics that are shaped like books in this presentation. So thank you for hanging with me on that. And that is all that I have for you today. My email address is here. If you would like to reach me, we're going to do some Q&A, and I'll drop a link in a chat to some resources in a Google folder in case you would like to share in any of these. Greg, do we have any questions?
Well, first of all, thanks, Rebecca. Appreciate you taking the time to do this today. Looks like you had a lot of interest, a lot of people participating. So good, very good job. No questions have come through. Well, wait, one here. Has anyone tried a book club for mixed levels and did it work well? You have any experience with that, Rebecca, or anybody else?
I have tried this. I think it really depends on what the levels are. In one of the situations where I used this, I was teaching a group of pre-GED learners who were non-native English speakers, and they were also not Spanish speakers. So the GED wasn't available in their native language. That group was pretty widespread. And it did work, but it was really important in how I paired the students up in reading so that nobody was embarrassed, but everybody got enough time to understand. Another thing, if your group is mixed and lower, is that some of the emerging adult readers now, like all of the Gemma Open Door readers from New Readers Press, some of the titles in that series come with both a free audio support and something that is a one-page lowered level reading text. So you could potentially have students reading the same story written at multiple levels, and that can be a really good way to work if you're in a very multiple level group. Gemma Open Door and Orca, Lonnie is asking, are both companies that publish emerging adult readers. They are available on the New Readers Press website under Pleasure Reading, and I will drop a link to that in the chat for you, Lonnie. Do you see any other questions, Greg?
Yes, from Daniel, could you mention again the names of the best publishers or presses for ESL
Yes.
readers?
I'm sorry, hang with me for 1 second. I'm going to drop the link to the New Readers Press Pleasure Reading into the chat right now. So full disclosure, I do work for New Readers Press as well as the college, and I love these. It's one of the things that attracted me there. But a previous group of educators asked me to create a list of books that I like for reading for book clubs of my own. And Daniel, I put that in the Google folder that I've shared with you, and not all of them are from New Readers Press. So you'll be able to see the title, author, and the reading level of all of the books on the book club list in that folder. It's not fully complete, so I continue to add to it. Does that answer your question? Lane says she uses Reading A to Z online, where you can get stories at different levels. That's a great idea. The stories are aimed at children, so they're not all appropriate, but you can pick through those and find what works best for your group.
Another question, can you share the title of the book that has generated great interest among the students?
The book that the series that I really like for low-level readers is, let me drop a link to it in the chat. These are very low level, but they're just hilarious and funny. They're called The Heights. There are 5 different books in this little series. If your students are a little bit higher, check out the Gemma readers, because those range from 3.0 to 7. So there's a wide range there. And there's adult content. There's also some like 16 to 20-year-old content. So those are clearly marked, but be sure that you check that out before you give your 50-year-old group a book about a 16-year-old. Depending on their life circumstances, they may or may not like that.
All right, no more questions in the chat. There are some comments though, and I'll leave the session open here for a couple more minutes if anybody wants to go through there and copy those links. Again, thank you, Rebecca. We appreciate the time today. And
thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate you spending the hour with me.